Hi, my name is Millie Mattis, and I am your worship associate this morning. My assignment for this reflection was to find a moment in my life when the light bulb went on, for that aha experience, when one's reality shifts just a little bit in a new direction. Early in my life, I had no contact whatsoever with diverse people. Everyone in my environment was white, religiously affiliated, and neither too rich nor too poor. The grammar school was 1 block away, and so easy to walk to that we had 0 snow days for my entire time I was there. The only exposure I had to different types of people was from children's books like Little Black Sambo and the comedy of television and radio programs of Amos and Andy and Jack Benny with his Rochester. By the 4th grade, I was taking 3 buses on Saturdays to get downtown to play in the All-City Youth Orchestra. There, I finally saw some black and brown people up close, but there was no meaningful interaction, and I knew nothing of their histories or interests. My big awakening happened after I began high school. I had been recruited to enter 9th grade at the Cass Technical High School, where I had attended youth orchestra, for their science and arts program, which was comprised entirely of AP-type classes before AP had been invented. This was a specialized school with 23 different curriculums from journalism, math, art, music, the sciences, HVAC, auto repair, home economics, etc. Most were college prep, but some were vocational. And both types frequently led directly to jobs or apprenticeships in the various fields. Indeed, several of our violinists went immediately after graduation to play in renowned symphonies in Dallas, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles. Having the impression that the special recruitment letter made me a big deal indeed, I entered the school with confidence. The student body as well as faculty was about half white and half black, or I should say persons of color. Well, I was prepared to really shine alongside these people who presumably did not have all my advantages. Read white privilege. It was quite an adjustment to be thrown together with such an assortment of the types of people I had never known. First, from my previous very limited exposure to blacks, my expectations of finding common ground were exceedingly low. I expected to be top dog in most situations. Then, imagine my horror as I found myself almost immediately outspelled, outmathed, outplayed, outdressed, and so on, by the very people I was prepared to be indulgent with from my presumed position in the dizzying heights above them. To illustrate another chasm between our life experiences, when I showed up to one girl's home for a sectional rehearsal and a sleepover, I was instructed to proceed to the library to wait for the others. The library? You could have fit 3 buildings the size of my family home into that mansion in Midtown Detroit. Well, All I can say is that because of others' tolerance and patience in coaxing me out of my belief in the formerly held stereotypes, I was able to transition to a fuller and humbler view of human diversity and talents, and develop the warmest of friendships with my fellow students, the memory of which is still making me smile today. In engaging in this reflection, it has occurred to me that my life would have been so very limited had this experience not knocked enough sense into me to more fully appreciate the range of others' dimensions and abilities, honoring different cultural mannerisms and accomplishments. My most colorful friends gave me the ultimate gift of their tolerance, love, and attention. I am now trying to radiate that out to the world in remembrance.
Our reading today is from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. It's from her TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, which we posted to our Facebook page this week. So if you'd like to find it, you can find it there, if you don't think that you can remember Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. When I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States, I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well, and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So after I had spent some time in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people, fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. Have y'all ever noticed that when someone tells a story, and that story includes someone who is ignorant, belligerent, bigoted, backwards, that stupid person in the story almost always has a Southern accent? And that this is true even if the story takes place in Michigan or New Hampshire or Oregon. The reading today was from a terrific TED Talk. And in it, Adichie does an admirable job of painting a more complex picture of her home country, Nigeria. I decided that I would like to share some stories with you today about my home country of Texas. I want to do this for two reasons. One is that I think it is relevant to the moment, to current events in this country, and to the fight for justice in this country, all over this country. And I also want to sit for a moment with how it feels when our complexity is denied, when we are reduced to a single story, and ask, can we turn that feeling into compassion and curiosity about others and those that are othered? Can we begin to ask ourselves whose stories have been flattened into a single story that we've just accepted? Adichie's so cool, calm, and collected in her TED Talk. And I'm going to do my best to emulate her, but I will confess that I have sometimes gotten hot under the collar about this topic. So, when I was a senior in high school, my family moved from Texas to suburban New York, Nyack in Rockland County, if you know the area. Quite frankly, my reaction to this news was, thank God I'm leaving this backwards, reactionary, homophobic, claustrophobic, Bible-thumping backwater. I was going to New York. It was the suburbs, yeah, but we were going to be living closer to New York City than I currently was living to Houston, and my friends and I went to Houston all the time. Went to clubs, concerts. I was excited. It was going to be so progressive and open-minded. I was starry-eyed. We moved to a neighborhood that was overall wealthier than where we had been in Texas. But the high school was similar in terms of the size, around 2,000 students, and the academic achievement. What I learned over the course of that year was that when it comes to kindness and inclusivity and justice, by and large, Northerners are not any different than Southerners. There may be different players, but the dramas were the same. I had a front row seat for anti-Semitism in New York. That was not something that I had encountered in Texas, which is not to say that there's not anti-Semitism in Texas. Of course there is. But rather, what I mean is that when there are only a handful of Jewish people in your community, it's easy for non-Jews to be oblivious to what anti-Semitism looks like in practice, to believe that it doesn't happen there. And maybe we, in the whitest large city in America, can relate to that here in Portland. So, I witnessed some shocking things in New York with regard to that, and I learned to be more attuned to that particular brand of discrimination. And since New York schools are among the most segregated in the nation, my new school was much less diverse than the one that I had come from. So I learned about a lot of other systemic situations that were remarkably similar and in some cases worse than where I had come from. On a more prosaic note, classmates in New York would casually say things like, yeah, he's really cute, but I'm not allowed to date Catholics. Or Jews, or Irish Catholics because they were Italian. Man, people will find anything to create an us and them over. And here's another thing. I remember looking around after a couple of months and noticing that no one who was out of the closet was in any of my classes. No one. My friend group in Texas had been joyously, loudly queer. And yes, there was definitely bullying and discrimination that went along with that. But there were also allies and support and fierce pride. Meanwhile, in New York, my classmates stayed closeted a lot longer, until college or adulthood. The culture wasn't open enough for them to feel safe coming out in high school. It was progressive on paper, but in practice it felt very conformist and conventional. While I was processing these observations and realizing that the supposedly progressive North was neither better or worse in most ways than where I had come from, I was also being treated to a nonstop chorus of comments from my new classmates and some teachers saying things like, oh, how lucky you got out of the South, you must be so relieved. Or correcting correcting or mocking my accent, which was much stronger at the time, assuming I wouldn't have read things that they had read because Texans are undereducated. I mean, as if they didn't know the meaning of the word rude. Other people's children. Bless their hearts. Moving to New York made me a Southerner. And in the years since, I have lived in a lot of places, both in the US and elsewhere. And what I have found, everywhere I have gone, is what my classmate Beth Monholland calls people-peopling. Just people-peopling. There's no mythical, highly evolved group of people who have worked this all out. Not anywhere on this planet, as far as I can tell. We are all stuck in the weeds, peopling. A young woman from Houston named Ellie Ashby has a column in the Harvard Crimson, the student paper. She's a current Harvard student, class of 2024. She wrote this last year. Growing up in Texas, I only wanted to leave. I wanted to flee the closed-minded and traditionalist coffin of the former Confederacy and find refuge among the revered Northern progressives. But then I actually left. I made the long trek from Houston to Boston, toting my naive optimism that the North had it figured out and it was the place people told me it would be. But Houston and Boston are more alike than people realize. She goes on, I'd internalized a binary of the South always being bad and the North always being good. The South has problems. Understatement, I know. But what I did not realize before moving to Boston was that the North has the exact same ones. The justice system is inefficient and unjust. People can be closed-minded and unkind, and policies are discriminatory and unhelpful. The capitalist interests of the companies run a city, not the people, and there are good people working through that mess, trying to make something beautiful and more equitable out of it all. 3 decades after I moved from Houston to New York and had my grand disillusionment, Ellie Ashby is having the exact same experience from Houston to Harvard. It made me want to hug her. So that's anecdotal. Let's talk about some facts. I have a limited time with you this morning, so in the interest of brevity and in light of the enslavement of African Americans being paramount in the single story that we have about the South, let's talk about African Americans in the US. I would like to share with you a list of cities. There we go. This list was compiled by Forbes magazine. It's titled, US Cities Where African Americans Are Doing the Best Economically, as of 2018. Forbes looked at home ownership rates, self-employment rates, median household income, and whether or not the population of African Americans in that city was growing or diminishing. Now, we could debate whether or not Washington, D.C. and Baltimore are southern cities. There's a case to be made either way, I think. But either if you think of them as northern, that still means that 8 of the 10 cities on this list are southern, and 3 of them are in Texas. Well, I'll be. I found a 2022 report that asked the same question, but with different criteria. For example, they looked at education rates, representation in professions such as doctors or lawyers, and how those home ownership rates and median incomes compared to families who were Euro-American. It was almost the exact same list, give or take a city or two. They added Dallas, bringing it up to 4 in Texas. Other lists Ones that included much smaller communities began to branch out into places in California or the Midwest. But when it came to major metro areas, it was pretty consistent that better economically to be in the South. So what story does this list of cities tell us about the South or about Texas? Certainly not the usual one. Not that dangerous single story of the bad, racist South and the enlightened, benevolent North. My experience of growing up in Southern Texas, which is a specific thing, right? If you're from El Paso, you're not Southern. My experience is that my community there was remarkably diverse. I had elementary school classmates who were African American. Texas is 14% African American. And Vietnamese and Filipino and Indian. It's 6% Asian American. There are recent immigrants from Central America, and of course, many, many Mexican Americans. Texas is 40% Latinx. And if you are keeping track, we are at 60% BIPOC right now. It should be noted, though, that a whole lot of Mexican Americans in Texas look like me. My grandfather's from Mexico. I'm Mexican American. So, what this diversity means is that, yes, there's definitely racism, overt, ugly racism. But there's also more joy and more relationship, more interracial classmates, teammates, coworkers, friends, lovers, spouses. This is why the far right is losing their dang minds down there. I think I have a very typical Texas family. Some of us are evangelical, some of us are atheists, some are new agey. We are intermingled, Scottish and Bohemian and Mexican. Each generation is more Mexican than the last, actually. Our family reunions have a couple of ministers, a couple of ex-cons. Some of us voted for Trump, others campaigned for Beto O'Rourke. My mother's been known to vote for the Green Party. I have a stepbrother who's gay, a nephew who is trans. We're an all-American family. And the thing is, all of us, of all ethnicities and religious beliefs and political persuasions, of all genders and orientations, we're all Southern. My Pentecostal minister Uncle Jimmy is not more Southern than my mother, or than me. Maybe he's more Southern than me. I did move away a long time ago. Anyway, I have a final slide for us. Sojourner, could we have the slide with the election results, please? All right. The 2020 election results. Texas and Oregon. A red state and a blue state. You can take a moment to absorb those numbers. Oregon and Texas may be the most caricatured states in our polarized nation right now. Portlandia versus the Lone Star State whose leadership threatened to secede as recently as 2020. But those numbers are not so different. Winning with 52% versus winning with 56%. And it's worth noting, too, that 4 million more Texans voted for Biden than Oregonians. So, look, things in Texas are a hot mess right now. That abortion ban and the situation for trans youth, the gerrymandering, the voter intimidation, there's a lot to be aghast at. I'm worried. But when the rest of the country only tells a single story about the South or about Texas, It ignores the human complexity. It disrespects the tireless work being done locally to move toward justice. It ignores our similarities. It kind of allows the rest of the country to say, well, we're not doing so bad, and maybe not work as hard. And from the inside, in the South, there's a narrative that says, look at how they see us. We know we're not that bad. So why should we listen to those criticisms, right? In a sense that you'll never be understood. So that binary of the bad South and the benevolent North distracts us from the log in our own eye. It becomes easy to be complacent. So what? What does this mean for us? There are so many communities, groups of people about which we only have a single story, and we may not even know, right, when we're falling prey to that. Today I've explored one example that, as it happens, I could personally speak to. When I think about how it has made me feel through the years to encounter this single story of my home state, of my family as Texans, it feels awful. It's something that I'm braced against when I tell somebody that. There's going to be that eye roll, and there's going to be that assumption that they know how I must feel about my family and my childhood, a commiseration or pity, or a, well, you're not really Southern, right? You're one of the good ones. So, when a people, any people, is shown as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, that's what they become in our minds. And when I think about how I feel in that one instance, which is not even the worst it could be, right? There are much more serious narratives of being othered. But when I think about how I feel, I hope that I can take that feeling and transform it into a compassion and a curiosity, a humility and a curiosity about what stories I don't know, whose complexity I am failing to see. One of my favorite parts from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk is when she describes her trip to Guadalajara. When she arrived there and saw people going about their lives, working, laughing, just living a normal life, you know, she initially felt a little bit surprised. And then she was overwhelmed with shame. She realized that she had been so immersed in the US media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in her mind, the abject immigrant. She had bought into the single story of Mexicans. She who had spent so much time unpacking the single story Americans told her about her own homeland of Nigeria and trying to get them to see the complexity. I too have had these moments when I realized that I had bought into a single story about someone else. It's humbling, which is how we say humbling in Texas. What I take from this is that the work of seeing people in their complexity, of perceiving that they have more than one story, it's not a switch you can flip, an upgrade to your operating system. If you get to know someone and they add complexity to your understanding of the group that they are a part of, that doesn't mean that you won't stumble across it elsewhere with someone else from a different group. It's ongoing work. It's a spiritual practice. It requires compassion and so much curiosity, an invitation to others to tell a new story that maybe you haven't heard before. Oh, you're from Texas? What's that like? What do you miss about it? May it be so.